In the axioms of communication, we talked about a number of laws that on which communication functions. One of which is that communication is packaged, okay, and that package is both verbal and nonverbal messages that are going on. So we're going to talk about the nonverbal side of the house here, and really, there's so much information here that we can talk about that we could take up an entire semester. But I've narrowed it down to 4 different areas of study here: kinesics, paralinguistics, oculesics, and proxemics. And these are all kind of funky sounding terms. They all are categories of study in terms of nonverbal tells that we put out there. So I'll give you a definition of each of these. Kinesics dealing with movement, paralinguistics dealing with language, and a paralanguage, the other language. Oculesics is eye behavior, and proxemics is what we do with the space that's around us. And all these things come together and pack some powerful messages. In fact, most of what we communicate is nonverbal, 70 to 80%, depending on the relationship and the context and what we're communicating. So there's a lot to consider here. The first one that we'll get into is this idea of kinesics or kinesics, depends on who you're talking to. And this really is a study on how the body moves and what the body is expressing within that movement. And that movement can be narrowed down into 4 other categories. 5, actually. There's a gross motor category in terms of how we walk and sit and do things that way. But the 4 we'll study here deal with emblems, illustrators, regulators, and adapters. There's a 5th one here, affect displays as well, but we'll talk about that at the end of the video. The author of the interpersonal communication book lumps that into this category, and I don't agree with that. I think it really belongs in its own category, so we'll treat it that way. So kinesics here are the 4 ideas. Let's start with emblems. Emblems are usually socially derived. These are icons or signals that we do with our hands. We could do with our whole upper body as well, perhaps, that go through and communicate something like the OK symbol here. Emblems are derived from some type of cultural context. The middle finger, for example, we know that is probably one of the most ubiquitous emblems that are out there. And it didn't always mean what it means now. It got its start at about the same time that the British imperialists were invading northern France. And they sent their archers over there to go through and do away with those pesky Frenchmen. And when they were captured, the French, this was before they were decapitating people, instead of cutting off their heads, they would cut off their middle fingers because the archers needed their middle fingers in order to have the strength to draw back the bow and release the arrow. Think about that. Try to curl your first finger and your ring finger around the bow, around the string of a bow, and there's no strength. You couldn't possibly do that. You need to have that middle finger because its tendon goes all the way down to the base of the elbow, and it's the strongest finger in the hand. So the French would cut that off. Those archers who escaped their French captors and survived would turn to them while they were being pursued, and they gave them the middle finger and said, "I'll be back," basically. And that's where that comes from, kind of a vengeful thing. So it's a cultural meaning. It goes back centuries, and we've obviously changed that meaning up until now. So perhaps the next time you feel prompted to give somebody the middle finger, you'll think twice about that, perhaps. The next type of kinesic is what we call illustrators. And we use illustrators all the time to go through and illustrate what it is that we're trying to say. In Toy Story, when Buzz and Woody are underneath the pizza delivery car and they have that big falling out, and Woody tries to convince Buzz that he's a toy, he's a child's plaything, he's this small. That's an illustrator. He's illustrating how big he really is. And we do this a lot. We illustrate size and shape, we illustrate direction, all kinds of things that are out there. There's an interesting study out there that indicates that people who live in northern climes are less illustrative than people who live more equatorial. In southern climes, people who live in southern Italy are more expressive with their hands than people in northern Italy. People who live in Miami, same thing, more expressive than people who live in Fargo, North Dakota, mainly because it's cold, right? In those upper climes, and folks are walking around with their hands in their pockets or in mittens or something instead of using them to go through and supplement what it is they're trying to say in terms of illustrating what it is they're talking about. I'm having a hard time doing this without illustrating to you what it is that I'm talking about. I'm doing it anyway, even though no one is watching. So if illustrators illustrate, then the next one, regulators, go through and regulate. What do they regulate? They regulate communication. How we go through and talk. Try this. Next time you're in a heightened discussion with somebody, just close your mouth and point your finger at them. It's like it's magic. It'll stop them. And they'll say, what the heck are you doing? But still, it regulates the communication in terms of what's going on. We have all kinds of regulators. Our eyes can be regulators. We can make eye contact to go through and open a channel. We can break eye contact that closes a channel. That's a regulator. Somebody wants to talk to us. We don't want to talk to them. We might turn a shoulder to them, and that regulates, that shuts it down. We can regulate by looking at our cell phone instead of paying attention to who it is that we're talking to. That's a regulator. Okay, that'll go through and shut things down. So they open and close communication channels, okay? And conversationally, we have certain turn cues that we get into that go through and say, okay, I'm done talking now. It's your turn to talk. That might be done through opening a hand out and extending that to that person and making eye contact with them. Those are regulators. None of these, by the way, like everything else we talk about, are mutually exclusive. We do these in combinations with illustrators or with emblems. In fact, an emblem can be a pointed finger as well. Okay, we can go through and have meaning assigned in a number of different ways just with the same type of signifier in terms of that pointing finger happening. The next category is what we call adapters. And this is kind of the garbage can for everything else to go into it that doesn't neatly fit into the categories of illustrators, regulators, and emblems. So they kind of put into adapters. What's fascinating about this, though, is that we're learning that adapters aren't as innocuous as we really thought they were just a few years ago. They become more telltale as well. I study lying. I used to work as I don't want to go there. As an interrogator, and as an interrogator, I'd be watching the types of lying tells that my subjects would be putting out there. And we started paying more attention after researching to what the adapters might be going through and indicating. An adapter can be something as easy, as simple as scratching your neck, maybe wiping something underneath your eye, putting your hand up to your chin and holding your head, putting your hand maybe over your mouth as an adapter. But we're finding, though, that physiologically, when we feel that we are being stressed, when we start to escalate physiologically, our heart rate starts to accelerate, we're breathing more rapidly, our blood pressure increases, our body responds physiologically in a way that creates symptoms, okay, like itching, for example, more prevalent in women than in men, but itching along the face and the neck when they become a little bit more escalated. And when they start scratching that, while it looks right off the bat as an adapter, they just trying to go through and take care of a little need of getting that little itch. When they start doing it rapidly and in succession, it becomes an indicator beyond an adapter that perhaps they are heightened within their own physiology. They're afraid or they're nervous about what might be going on. So these categories on the surface level can go through and have a meaning to them if we know how to interpret them. Again, the research shows about half of the people involved in communication get it and half don't, which is a pretty squirrely number if you're looking at, peer-reviewed, valid type of research. It's a 50-50 kind of a thing. And who has it and who doesn't, It's something that can be learned. It's also something, that I've found through working with interns in my line of work, that some are natural they have a natural ability to go through and decode what's going on in terms of kinesics. We call these folks wizards, with the ability to go through and inherently understand what people are saying non-verbally. All right, the next category is this idea of paralinguistics. It's not what you say, you might want to write that down, but how you say it. Para meaning other, linguistics meaning language. So this is the language, a nonverbal language that we are using to go through and communicate with. So there are a number of aspects to this. There's rate. Rate is the cadence of delivery. If we're becoming escalated, like this guy here, it could be short, rapid bursts, like machine gun fire going out, in terms of what it is they're saying. Or it could be slow and relaxed and storytelling, and it could be narrative. It can go through and break patterns. Those who speak in patterns become very boring to listen to. They can establish kind of a yawn cadence along with the rate cadence. Speaking of that, then is speed. It's the overall speed of delivery. And I have a tendency, especially when I'm involved in a class discussion, to speak very quickly because I have so much going on in my brain. I want to make sure I get it all out there. And so I go through and speak quickly. Increasing speed shows escalation. When people start talking more, it's not a sign that they're becoming relaxed. Okay, they're becoming more escalated. A sudden decrease can indicate that they've reached a threshold. Okay, I train in law enforcement in recognizing threat assessments, and when an officer is dealing with an individual who was spewing to begin with, and then they've hit this wall and they've stopped, it's indicative that they've reached a threshold, and the officer needs to back off. They need to literally increase the space that exists between them, because it's a sign of an escalated threat. Next is this idea of tone. And this is the volume. And in some cases, what are called bitones or tritones that are reached when we become more escalated. Men reach a secondary tonality, and it's a growl under the normal tone that can also indicate a threshold of threat. And you need sometimes it's indiscernible. Sometimes it needs to be recorded, and you go through in the recording and see a second wave, a bitone happening within that. Women can reach 2 additional tones as well. And sometimes that third tone is not discernible by ear. It needs to be recorded and analyzed that way. But nonetheless, the tonality there goes through and starts to indicate the level or the rate of escalation that the individual might be involved with. Not just the opposite of this is true. As somebody becomes more relaxed, the voice tone, the tonality, the volume goes down, more speaking volume, more friendly, more interpersonal. We start to lose that bitone or tritones that might be inundating what's happening, and it becomes more of a lilt. It's easier to listen to when we like that sound. Pitch is the last of the 4 ideas here of paralinguistics. It's different from tone in that the frequency of the voice rises, okay? Tonality is the overall sound of the voice. The pitch is the frequency of that voice. So if you could think of it in terms of notes, higher notes, lower notes, stress goes through in most folks and constricts the vocal cords, and by doing so, it takes the voice up a note or 2, or in some folks up an octave, depending on their baseline and where they're at. And then the more relaxed we become, the voice can go down and go below their normal speaking level, and indicative of being more relaxed and less escalated there. Paralinguistics is it's a fascinating study. We'll get more into this a little bit in a second video I think I'll do for this section in nonverbal, where we get into what's called semantic aphasia, where, again, it's not what we say but how we say it. It's a trailing off of what might be a cogent thought, indicative that the brain is engaging in some type of an evasive or potentially maybe an offensive action there, that they're already thinking about striking out, and so the brain just kind of trails off into kind of nonsense We'll have a couple of examples of that. So look for that video after this one as well. All right, so let's see. We've gotten into kinesics and paralinguistics. Coming up next here is one of my favorite spots is oculesics. And this deals with eye movement. It deals with indexing within eye movement. We'll talk about that a little bit. Again, in the training that I do for law enforcement, we talk about what indexing is and how significant that is. It's a study of eyelids and their movement, what they do, and lastly, this concept of pupil dilation and what goes on with that physiologically, why we end up doing that. So let's get into eye movement first here. Our eyes move when we speak, and researchers and observers have noticed over time that there are certain patterns in which one might engage that might go through and indicate that they're lying or that they're telling the truth. There's an old theory, a left brain, right brain theory out there, that if the eyes went to a certain quadrant, up to the upper left, for example, that they might be lying, or if the eyes go to the upper right, it might be that they're actually recalling information. The creative side of our brain and the analytical side of the brain. The problem with this hooey, really, and it's funny that the face on here comes is who it is. Anyway, the concept here is that this is based on left brain, right brain thinking. And that we're all left brain creative, right brain analytical, and we're not. In fact, the most recent research shows something completely different from that. It's fascinating to see how folks go through and capitalize off this whole left brain, right brain. We'll see now here the left brain is going through and being analytical, and the right brain is being the creative side. Now, there are some folks out there who have confusion of the hemispheres that goes through and disproves the theory. I'm one of those. While I am very creative, I'm also very analytical. I'm dyslexic. My brain functions pretty closely on both sides of my head the same way in terms of both creativity and analytics, which is a little weird for me. And I struggle with that in terms of keeping things straight, left, right, that kind of thing. This is an ad from Mercedes-Benz that goes through and says, well, our vehicle, while it goes through and appeals to your analytical side in terms of all the performance, it also appeals to your right side of your brain. And again, like I said, the problem is this is a bunch of hooey. In fact, what we're coming to find out is that we don't think differently necessarily in the hemispheres. We think differently in the depth of the hemispheres on both sides, equilaterally as we go, which I think is fascinating. Let's see, there was something else there that I wanted to get into. Oh, okay. So if we can go through and define as something as right brain or left brain, as somebody as right brain or left brain, and then once we have that definition, then we see that their eyes, now remember the optic nerve here is switched, right? So if I am indeed right brain creative, left brain analytical, okay, the creative side is where I'm going to go through and construct. I'm going to create the lie, right? The left side, the analytical side, is the side that goes through and says, oh, where were you last Tuesday at 7 p.m.? Well, let me look at you were at Cafe Rio. I can often be found at Cafe Rio Tuesday nights at 7 o'clock, right? Okay, so that's where you were. That's a fact. So I'm not creating that on the analytical side. But since the optic nerve is switched, right? So if I am right brain creative, and you asked me where I was last Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, I don't want to lie to you that I was not at Cafe Rio, the theory would argue that as I try to remember, my eyes would go not to the right side, but up to the left side, okay, because I'm right brain creative. Now, if I'm trying to remember where I was and I get into the truth, then the eyes would go up to the right side. All right. So those are visual constructs. There's an auditory construct that happens in the middle. If the eyes go directly left or directly right, there, what's going on. And then there's an affective construct or maybe a verbal construct. If the eyes go down, if they go down to the analytical side, there's an internal dialogue happening within that. If it goes down to the creative side, it gets more into accessing feelings. Now, I've played with this for a number of years in my previous life, and there were times when it worked and there were times when it didn't work. So, like all theories, nothing is absolute. This theory is becoming less and less viable and credible in terms of going through and figuring out whether or not somebody is telling the truth. Indexing, I referred to a little bit ago. I'm going to put this into eye movement as well. Indexing is where, so this is, these are two actors that we use in scenario-based training for law enforcement. And what happens is the officer knocks on the door, is greeted, comes in, and this is what he sees. The young woman seated in the chair, the man who's confrontational. And while he's talking, his eyes dart around the room because there's paraphernalia hidden within the room. It could be illicit substances, it could be a weapon, whatever. And as his eyes flit to one side of the room, the officer watches his behavior because that flitting, if you will, is indexing, where the eyes go. It's all part of eye movement. Our eyes move up and down, back and forth. Rapid eye movement back and forth might indicate escalation. Locked on alpha male stare might also indicate escalation, okay? Because there are two ends of this the spectrum of eye movement. Eyelids are just as telling as eye movement in terms of things like blink rate, squinting, the alpha male stare, those types of things. When we're involved in deposing a target, one person on the team goes through and counts the number of times that they blink while we're baselining the individual. We're just in casual conversation. We might be outside of the room, of the interrogation room or the conference facility, and we're just talking, and one of my interns is just going through and watching blink rates and counting how many blinks per minute, kind of a thing. And then once we get involved in the room, or we get into questions that might escalate, we start to see what the blink rates are doing as well. The same person's going through and counting them at that point. Now, what's interesting about this is you hook somebody up to a polygraph machine, and guess what's going to happen? They're going to become inherently escalated, and their blink rates are going to increase without even asking them a question. Or just the room itself is going to go through and up the ante in terms of their own anxiety. So there are lots of things to take into consideration when looking at this kind of data. Another thing to consider is the relative humidity of the place you're actually doing this, because in St. George, if you and I are having a conversation, we're probably blinking a whole lot more because there's very little humidity depending on the weather and the time of day, kind of thing. But our blink rates are going to be accelerated naturally because of the lack of moisture that's going on. We blink to go through and moisturize the eye. So if we're talking and you try not to blink if you get into that alpha male stare thing going on, which is totally counterintuitive to what you've got happening physiologically with you. Something's up there. But all these things need to be taken into consideration as in terms of those blink rates. And then we've got squinty eyes going on. William Jefferson Clinton was the squinty eye king when it came to his deposition on Capitol Hill, his testimony about his affair with Monica Lewinsky. And when he wasn't blinking or squinting, he was very wide-eyed as well. And the wide-eye thing also goes beyond that parameter of natural eye behavior. And it's an indication inside his brain, well, if I go wide-eyed, it means that I'm not lying. Okay? The squinting is more of an autonomic response there. Psychologically, though, it is if I close my eyes or squint enough to where you can't see my eyes, then you can't tell that I'm lying there within that intensity. It's the reason why I had such a hard time with this guy, Ben Carson. And at the risk of being irreverent, looks like Ben's praying here. He's not. Ben cannot keep his eyes open during an interview on any of the Sunday morning shows, during a stump speech, during a campaign appearance. The guy couldn't keep his eyes open. And that's telling to me of a lot of things. And I'll spare the interpretation of that. But I'm glad he didn't end up on the ticket. No, I'll just shut up and start. Move on from there. Ben Carson, Mr. Closed Eyes. Next is this concept of pupil dilation. And I'm fascinated here by all kinds of fodder you can find out there in that intersphere web thing that goes through and tells you, what a constricted pupil says versus what a dilated pupil says. And really, there are just certain conditions under which our pupils do that, where they constrict or they dilate. The dilation is more telling than anything. And here, I found this on the internet. That's not entirely true. First off, we don't know what their baseline is. What is their pupil size normally? And then does that pupil go larger or smaller? So baselining is really kind of key to go through and having an accurate interpretation of what's being put out there non-verbally. There are some main conditions under which our pupils do their job. The first one is obviously light. Our eyes go through and adjust according to the amount of light so we can pull some kind of exposure. If you've ever sat in a dark movie theater on a Saturday afternoon matinee and walked out into the brilliant sunlight of St. George in the afternoon, you took a while to go through and have your pupils adjust to the exposure. And that's natural, okay? That's a defense mechanism, a physical one for us, so we can see in darkness. They can only dilate so much, and then the optic nerve kind of gives up, and it turns all that data acquisition over to the rods and cones in our eyes. We see better in our periphery in the dark than we do right in the center of our vision, something to keep in mind. Anyway, I'm getting off track. So when I mean all, I mean both male pupils and female pupils dilate physiologically according to the amount of light that's going on. Now, we are the same in one other way. Men's eyes, pupils will dilate when they're angry, and they'll dilate when they're fearful that way. And of course, they dilate if they're drunk or if they're high, or all the substances aside here. Just the natural dilation happens based on certain dopamine and serotonin chemicals that are happening, but most of these are tied to those two emotions, anger and fear. Women's eyes dilate under fear as well, not so much under anger, which might explain a few things to us men, why we can't tell if she's angry or not, because her pupils aren't going through and giving us that tell. But when they're afraid, they will dilate. Here's something interesting. When women lie, their pupils dilate. And the reason being there is because they're relational. And there is, believe it or not, an ethical tie. They feel bad, not everybody, not all of them. I know some women who lie without feeling bad about it at all. But for the most part, if there is that conscious connection to the ethics of telling the truth, women's pupils will dilate if they feel bad in telling a lie, which doesn't speak very highly of men, by the way, because apparently we're not as connected that way. We're more content oriented than we are relationally. You need to watch the video that I'll be producing for that when it talks about the differences in the genders with that. So one other, to confuse it even more, the other condition under which women's eyes dilate is when they are sexually aroused. So I've given you one of the great secrets here, men who might be watching this, as to why we are so confused. Because we don't know if women are lying about being aroused or if they actually are. Well, this is pretty fascinating. We can talk about oculesics all day, but I won't. I'll save you the hassle. I will post a little bit more about this in terms of content and relational dimensions in eye behavior. Next up is this idea of proxemics. It's the space that we have around us and how we use that space. And believe it or not, that goes through and communicates a lot about us. It communicates things artifactually, it communicates things territorially, and spatially. Let me go through all three of these so you have an idea. Proxemics is the space. These are three different areas of study within that space. The first one is artifactual proxemics. And this has to do with the stuff we put on ourselves, um, like this little nose ring. Actually, the nose ring is only one artifact here. The cut of her bangs, her makeup, the angle of her eyebrows, the A-line of her haircut, the line of her face, the diminished jawline, the lipstick, her eye color, the white, black, all of those things are artifacts. Okay, actually, I put this up just because she had a nose ring. Speaking of nose rings, artifacts can be cultural as well. I mean, look at the amount of artifacts going on here, and the tattoos and the hair and the textile around her neck and the choker, and it's wow. There's a lot of information there to go through and interpret, see what's going on. We adorn ourselves on all kinds of levels, but every single one of these levels become artifactual. It might be an earring, it might be a wedding ring, it might be a wristwatch, it might be the clothes that we wear, the fashions that we get into, it might even be the car that we drive, or the shoes that we wear. All these things, because you cannot not communicate, remember that axiom, or you're communicating all the time, what we have around or what we're wearing. Her purse is an artifact. The polka dots on the skirt, the black stockings, the sunglasses, the bun, all that communicates something. And if there's somebody there to interpret it, it's communicating. So chances are we're not living under a rock, okay? We're not reclusive. We're out in the public, and as a result, the artifacts that we choose to adorn ourselves with are communicating something, and that's happening non-verbally. Then we exist in a territory, and what we do with that territory also communicates something. And we're pretty guarded about our territories. Not quite this territorial, but we can be this territorial in terms of this is my side of the room, this is your side of the room. Anybody who's either been a college roommate, or they have served a Mormon mission, or they have been married, can contest to the fact that we all become territorial. If you have been a sibling with one other sibling, or 10 other siblings, what do you think? How does that territoriality measure from the person with one sibling to the person with 8 siblings? You think the person with 8 siblings would be the most territorial, but guess what? They're the least. I'll let you figure it out, see what's going on. How we decorate our domicile, where we live, goes through and speaks to us. Okay, how we customize our car, how we, while it's artifactual, it also becomes territorial. This territory here down the bottom right-hand side of this living area, while that's, those are all artifacts, those artifacts go through and say, this is my territory. Spatial is next, and actually there are 4 different kinds of space that we keep around us as human beings, and that changes according to culture as well. All right, some cultures there is great space that's observed. Northern Europe, the Netherlands, other cultures, very space doesn't mean anything. Some Asian cultures, or some Polynesian cultures that we can get into. Basically, for Northern American observations here, there's 4 different spaces that we get into. The first one being a public space, which is anywhere about 12 feet or above. There's not a whole lot of conversation happening within this because of the distance. It would be a little awkward to carry on a conversation with somebody who is 12 feet away from you. Most of the conversations happening here, if anything is happening at all, is happening non-verbally, with a wave or a nod or eye contact or something along that line. And then if that's accepted or reciprocated, and if there's time, we'll stop, and then we'll get closer, okay? And then we get into a social space, which is about 9 to 6 feet, maybe 5 feet. The social space is where, and I don't have a good depiction of this, this could be construed as social space, but you can see he's even his leaning encroaches on her personal space. A social space would be where we would have some mutual agreement as to whether or not we touch each other. So a handshake with somebody might be considered to be a social space because you can reach out and they can reach out and have that mutual clasp of the hand, but we really can't touch each other beyond that. We'd have to take another step forward in order to encroach into their personal space. President Trump does this often. If you look at the handshaking that he's done, when he shakes somebody's hand, he'll shake it and then he'll pull them into his space, which speaks volumes there non-verbally. And that space is personal space. And that's what we're seeing here with this guy at the headphones at the airport. He's kind of encroaching on the woman she's obviously leaving her territory to kind of get away from him. There, that personal space is about 3 feet. Okay, 3 feet to our intimate space, and I'll get into that here in just a minute. Communication varies then depending on the amount of room that exists, and obviously depending on the relationship that we have with people. Because if in that bottom right-hand image, if she is a stranger, we see this activity going on. But what if she's this guy's spouse and they had a fight? There's an entirely different dynamic to the space that exists now between these two individuals. And then there's intimate space. And you can imagine what that space involves and what level of the relationship that we expect to have. In order for that type of encroachment to happen. We all know some close talkers, for example, people who get in your space and try to communicate. I have a hard time with that. I have to back away because I have some kind of space issue, some kind of bubble issues. Well, this has already gone too long. I'll spare you the story. Maybe I'll write it and post it under the notes that you can go through and take a look. So that's the spatial aspect of what it is that we're talking about here in terms of proxemics as we go. I talked about affect displays, and these typically are part of the kinesic area of study. And I've broken them out because there's some pretty critical study that's been going on here. Dr. Paul Ekman did a monumental 2-decade groundbreaking study of how we express ourselves. And not just us as Homo sapiens, as human beings, but these expressions cross borders into other species as well. And for a lot of folks, it's a little hard to swallow. I'll tell you, if you ever have a golden retriever, you know exactly what I'm talking about because they smile and they frown and they show fear. Lots of animals do, okay? So affect displays, Ekman studied people where they might have a neutral display and then within that neutral display, like what you're seeing here with Patrick, another expression might pop through that and then come back to the neutral because a person's trying to stay calm or they're trying to stay neutral, but they can't control the micro expression, an affect display that lasts only sometimes up to a 30th of a second, just flashes through, that really betrays what it is that they're actually feeling. These micro expressions deal in a number of areas here. There's something I've written about this. Let me talk about this. The discovery of nonverbal human tells from Dr. Paul Ekman. The concept is that while we may be feeling a base emotion, we might simultaneously be masking that emotion. Okay? Think of the powerful influence of manners or just being nice. Ekman asserts, though, that true emotions can punch through this patina of being nice or stoic or feigning interest. And these flashes of truth are called microexpressions because they often happen within that 30th of a second. And unlike language used to express emotions, microexpressions are universal regardless of the culture. Language doesn't matter, age doesn't matter, race, gender. In fact, Ekman's research discovered that primates and other mammals have universal signals for emotion as well as just like human beings do. And for humans, these emotions are identified here. Okay, they're identified as anger, they're identified as fear, surprise, happiness, sadness, disgust, contempt is the last one. Okay, these are the micro expressions, and this is what they look like. All right. Some subtle, some not so subtle. It's this last one. If you come away with anything out of this, I'm hoping it will be the ability to recognize this expression, because it is the one that is the most dangerous. In my training with law enforcement officers, this is the one that we spend the most time with, and it's the micro expression of contempt. Now, this is a neutral expression that you see here with Taylor happening, and this is what contempt looks like. You can see how the eyes go dead. You see an asymmetrical expression on his mouth where the right side is lifting up, almost in a lip curl. I'm going to go back to his baseline. Okay. The head comes down just a little bit, and this is all autonomic. Okay. Most people don't control their contempt look. They don't go, oh, I'm going to feel contemptuous, I'm going to express that, so there it is, and put it out there. Especially in microexpressions. Microexpressions have no control. Okay, they pop through what they're normally trying to feel or trying to express or trying to subdue, and that's how we understand perhaps that they might not be telling the whole truth in terms of what's going on. More often than not, microexpressions need to be studied through a recording device, through a video recording device, and frame by frame. Okay, a frame of recorded video is a 30th of a second or 24th of a second, depending on your device. And it can happen that fast in going through and detecting what's going on. So, wow, that's a lot to consider. Please go through and rewatch this video. Stop. Take some notes, go back. If you have questions, and I'm hoping you will, please post them on the discussion forum so we can go through and address that so everybody can benefit from your query. All right?